Welcome to the Social Workers radio talk show on WCDB Albany 90.9 FM with co-hosts Dr. Eric Hardiman and Alyssa Lotmore. Here at the Social Workers, we address issues important to our communities with social work students, alumni, and community partners as our guests.
As part of the University at Albany School of Social Welfare, we hope to take social work beyond the classroom and agency settings and directly to the public, because the public is the client. Catch us on air, online, and anytime.
Welcome to WCDB Albany. This is the Social Workers. I'm Eric, and I'm here with Alyssa.
Hey, Eric, it's so exciting to still be in this 60th anniversary year because we are talking to so many of our fantastic alums from throughout the years. So another one today.
It's really an amazing experience because, I think we both probably know that the school has a wide reach. The School of Social Welfare has produced in 60 years, just a slew of alumni that are all over the world, all over the country, doing all sorts of different things, achieving things quietly sometimes in the public eye, sometimes out of the public eye, but always doing interesting things, whether it's social work practice, whether it's working in government, whether it's working for policymakers, the legislature, whether it's, doing something outside of social work. Sometimes people leave the profession, but they still draw on their background in social work. So it's really cool to see all of what folks can do with a social work degree.
And that is exactly our guest today, because we are talking with a 1981 graduate of the MSW program who went into social work for many years and then switched to middle school teaching and now is writing books. So, Eric, why don't you introduce our guest?
So our guest today is actually a return guest, someone we've talked to before. This is Jordan Steven Sher. He's the author of 4 books, 3 of which focus on Bosnia. His latest 2 books are a nonfiction and a historical fiction, delving into the war in the 1990s in Bosnia that produced many war crimes and genocide. His new book is entitled Dark Shadows Hover, and it's his first for young adults. He knows, however, that the book will apply to folks of all ages. Being a former social worker, Jordan is a graduate of the University at Albany's School of Social Welfare, class of 1981, and a former teacher. He draws on his background in social work practice to craft his characters and explore their psychological and emotional development. With a strong understanding of how trauma informs one's life, Sher pays particular attention to that in his characters, regardless of their age. He's currently living in Northern California with his wife, and Alyssa and I had a great conversation with Jordan. I mean, this is, we have yet to read the book. It's about to come out, but we're excited about it. And, I can't wait to read it myself. We had a great conversation. I think, listeners, I think you'll enjoy finding out about Jordan, what brought him to becoming the author of his 4th book and sort of all the perspectives that he brings. And it's a really intriguing concept, the book, too.
So with that, let's go to our interview with Jordan.
Let's do it. Welcome, Jordan. Welcome to the Social Workers on WCDB Albany.
Well, thank you for having me. I really do appreciate it.
We're excited. Alyssa and I are excited to have you here on the show today, and we've got a lot to talk about, to tell folks about your new book, and sort of you're a return guest on our show, so we always like having return guests and can think of it as a continuing conversation. So welcome back. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, we've been talking a lot to alums because this is our 60th anniversary, and it's interesting because so many of our alums are doing different things. Here you are writing and, publishing new books. This is what book for you? How many books have you published? I can't even remember.
This is number 4.
Number 4.
Congratulations.
Yes. So let's just start in, because you were a social work student right here at the University at Albany back in 1981, correct?
That's
right.
And
how did you get from a social work student to writing books? Let's just start there.
Thank you. As we know, life is a journey, and there are many unexpected chapters. writing is definitely an unexpected chapter. But social work is at the core in a lot of what how I develop characters, for example. But I started out, I got my master's in social work, and I worked a few different jobs. Probably the most impactful was the first job I had at Capital District Psychiatric Center. I don't know if that even still exists, but as a
It
psychiatric,
absolutely does. Yeah.
okay, I was thrown into it. But I learned a lot about sort of the expanse of the human brain, human mind.
Mm.
I was in social work for 22 years. And like I said, had a few different jobs that I loved. I did. And I had some director roles and eventually an executive director role at an organization. Um, and again, as life would have it, it wasn't quite the right fit. And that's something, if I recommend anything to in any role, but in social work, it is important to find the right fit. And most of the roles I had were. This particular one as executive director was, and it wasn't. I am more of a sort of a humanist, and this job was not quite what I thought it would be. So I decided
Sure.
at that point to get my teaching credential. And the joke I use is, although I don't think it's that way anymore, I don't know. Where can I make much less money than a nonprofit? I know I'll teach. But in fact, actually, I made more money as a social worker, I think. Uh, but I went into teaching and taught for 13 years, taught language arts and social studies in middle school. And my social work training and experience kicked in as a teacher. It was
Yeah.
very important. And I was older at the time, but it was very important. Um, just at the core of whatever we do as social workers is to establish trusting relationships.
Mm.
So that was very, very important. I taught, and I'm kind of just quickly going through this. I taught for 13 years, mostly connected very well with the students and families. And again, it was my social work experience that allowed that to happen. The last year of teaching, I was teaching at a school where most of the kids were Latinx, either from their parents were Central America or Mexico. And at that time, and I'm hoping we do not return to this, but I think we might, kids were very worried about their parents being deported. They were really worried about it. And I decided I've got to do something. And my first book, which wasn't very sophisticated, but I interviewed 12 people who emigrated from their country here,
Huh.
from different countries, Mexico, Italy, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Iran, um, uh, Germany, even, and to tell their stories as to why people leave, their difficult and challenging situations, sometimes very violent situations. And I found that writing was very cathartic, but it was my way of presenting through words uh,
Mm.
what the experience is like, at least through the people I interviewed. And I found I really enjoyed writing, and that was, we could talk more about how I ended up with this, the new book that's out. Um, but the thread throughout always was um, the heart connection, which is what I
Mm.
really developed as a social worker.
It's fascinating to hear you. I'm curious, I guess, to go back a little bit further to find out how you originally found out about social work and how you made that decision to go get
Hmm.
your MSW. But one of the things I heard in the thread really clearly was, you started out in the mental health field, providing human services, using relationships to help people. Then you moved into teaching, which is, a whole different thing and a lot of helping kids through articulating ideas and then shifting into writing. So it's sort of like it's almost a natural progression of sharing your ideas in different manners. But I'm curious how you got to social work school. How'd you get to the University of Albany?
Well, I went to undergrad at Oswego,
Mm.
um, and I mean, I was sort of searching for a major. I mean, a time you go to as a freshman, 18 years old, and what did I know? I moved from Long Island to Oswego, and it's like, ah. Um, But the last couple of years, I was focusing much more on psychology classes, sociology. And one of the classes I took that really uh, struck a chord was it was a family, I think it was called Family Therapy Theory or Family Theory. And it was my senior year. I said, this is fascinating. And I didn't consider my family particularly, dysfunctional. We all have our whatever. But I learned a lot. I said, I want to continue to pursue this. But I didn't go to grad school right away. So I
Okay.
graduated in 1977 from Oswego. First couple of years, I took my bachelor's degree, and it really allowed me to work at Macy's luggage department, Baker's shoes. I mean, it was like, this is back then. And I said, it's okay to be out working, but not what I'm doing. That's not what I want to do. I ended up working at a sleep disorders clinic at Capital District Psychiatric Center. Psychiatrist was running it. It's a crazy job, but that's not what this interview is about. And I met a social worker at CDPC, the psych center, and got to just talking with him. And I said, that's what I want to do. That's what I want
Interesting.
to do. And I applied, did what I had to do, applied. And 2 years after I graduated Oswego, I started social work school, the program.
Great. Thank you for that history. We appreciate it.
Sure.
Now, for your career in social work, you said you worked different jobs, you've moved up to the executive director. What was your career like, and did that have any influence on the books that you have written?
Most of the work I did was very much either community services, usually it was some sort of community or human service, always community nonprofit, and always had components of mental health. And the job I had for the longest, and we moved to San Diego in 1985 from Albany. And I worked a couple years as a hospital social worker. And one of the things we had to do once a month or so, work in the ER, the emergency room. And again, I mean, hospital, these people are mostly with some sort of, particularly in the ER, acute trauma. And really started to recognize more so. I was not working in a psych hospital. Just recognize that any of us, can be put in these situations, and how do we deal with trauma? And that's really when I started to recognize that. The following number of years, I worked in again, it was a community-based program throughout California where we work with caregivers of folks with dementia, brain injury, and other neurologic impairment. And again, working with families, because it was a caregiver resource center, it's really helping to guide people through, and not necessarily telling them, but guide them through the process of grief and loss, and kind of help facilitate some change. So it really is, I don't think it's one particular, it's just sort of the progression of what I learned as a social worker, how I applied that. Probably honestly, my favorite job as a social worker really was at Albany Jewish Family Service. Actually, I'm sorry, San Diego Jewish Family Service, where I was a director, and the executive director, mostly what they did was counseling, but she had asked me to write grant proposals for various social service programs. And one of the ones I wrote was for a psychiatric case management grant. And we got that grant. And again, so it was always about, for me and my colleagues, and, understanding sort of systems, not just the individual human, but how these folks are impacted and do impact their variety of systems. So it just became so internalized. Yeah.
So, so your first book you mentioned was about stories of a dozen people or so who had moved here to the U.S. I mean, that sounds fascinating. I'd love to. I'll try to get the information. What was the title of that book? Do you?
Our Neighbors, Their Voices, Stories of Immigrant Exodus. If you go on my website, stevensher.com. And so all the books are listed. You could read some information about it.
Great, great. So that sounds like a particularly interesting book. I mean, to delve into these stories. but now you've moved into historical fiction, is that right? And you know, sort of in between, you've done some other types of writing. I guess tell us about your once you became an author and sort of completed that first book, what was the progression like to where you are now?
Well, two of the two women I interviewed, both of whom lived in Utica, because I have a strong Utica connection. That's where my wife's family immigrated to from Italy a long time ago. And so I have a lot of relatives there. And I put out the call for some people to interview, and I didn't know who that would be. But brother-in-law said, well, you know, I know a woman from Bosnia and know that she went through the war as a child. And then another relative, a niece of mine, said, yeah, and I know somebody else. So anyway, I didn't know anything about Bosnia. I didn't know about the war. I didn't know about the gender. I really knew nothing about it. But I got to thinking, I really want to talk with these these folks. And I got to thinking too, I don't know if they have Price Chopper in Albany, but in Utica they do. And just in my mind, I'm thinking,
Yeah.
so maybe you're shopping in an aisle and there's a woman with a Bosnian accent, and you know, she's asking, oh, could you reach for that can on top shelf? I can't grab it. And thinking, what did she go through? Because that war was brutal. I mean,
Yeah,
there was targeted killings, thousands of people killed for
right.
being Bosnian Muslim. So it took me to another place, and I decided to write historical fiction about a family in Bosnia during the war and kind of what went through. And I interviewed
Yeah.
I ended up finding a man and interviewed him. He lives in Brussels, but he was in 2 concentration camps during that war. So I just gathered lots of information. And the writing part, again, the characters that I developed, you know, they went through trauma. And then I had based on maybe people I knew or just what I knew about trauma. Um, you know, even in school as a teacher, there are many kids who had experienced in their neighborhoods trauma. So I had to develop the characters um, based on my understanding of that, understanding what war does. And I learned a lot in the research about the war and knew a lot about as a social worker and teacher.
Now, your new book is geared more toward youth. The other ones were more for adults, but this one is geared more toward youth. And I think it's being touted as a biographical fiction. Tell us a little bit how
That's right.
you went from maybe adult novels and now moving more to having these important topics be discussed at the youth level.
Again, I think, you know, this is where probably social work and as a former middle school teacher, I
Mm.
know what I would assign, uh, you know, reading. And I remember we had different reading, I don't know if it was levels, but different offerings for kids. And some, you know, our more sophisticated readers would read, you know, some of the higher level books. But it didn't matter. I wanted everybody to read. It was part of my assignments, etc. I decided, being second generation American Jew, that the region of Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia, many of us here in this country don't know much about it. I didn't know much about it, obviously, when I did research and interviewed people for the book, 2 previous books about Bosnia and the war in Bosnia. I learned a lot, but I wanted to know what happened because my grandparents and great grandparents fled Eastern Europe because of the pogroms and because, you know, they were targeted. There always has to be a targeted group, doesn't there? Unfortunately. But so they fled, and I said, well, what? I don't know anything about Jews in the former Yugoslavia during the Holocaust. And it just really intrigued me. But I wasn't sure what I was going to write about. A friend of mine in Boston, who's very involved in Bosnia still, he goes back and forth, and he said, yeah, I know this guy, Maris al-Bahari, who's a Sephardic Jew. And he said he's a real character. He actually, Mars died a couple of years ago at the age of 93. But I know he was in Tito's partisans as a youth. He was 12 when he began
Huh.
for 3.5 years. Because I know he was in Tito's partisans. I don't know much more than that, but maybe this is something you could research. So I ended up doing research and finding Morris's son who lives in Croatia, and we had numerous conversations. Morris's son didn't even know a whole lot about his father because his father, in fact, one of the first things that the son, his name was David, or Dado was his nickname, he said, yeah, I'd ask my father about the war, and he'd say, you don't want to know, which I think was almost because I have met other Holocaust survivors in my life who really mostly shy away from talking about it. It's the you don't want to know because it's so difficult. And Morris was kind of in that camp. But I ended up finding some video interviews in Croatian, Serbo-Croatian, 1997 from the Shoah Foundation at USC. And a friend of mine who I'd met through my previous writing lives in Utica. He was able to put English subtitles to these interviews. So I could see Morris and hear him and get the translation. So
Okay.
things just fell into place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this, and you're talking about your book now, which is tell us the title of the book and sort of how it emerged from your learning about Morris's story.
Well, again, it's called Dark Shadows Hover, and just launched yesterday. You could, I think if you just Google it, I'm sure, I know Amazon has it, Barnes and Noble, et cetera. But it again, I'm thinking as a social worker truly and a middle school teacher, because a lot of what I found out about Morris, they were bits and pieces. For example, during the war in the 90s, um, he and his wife's and David at the time, the son, they were out, but their apartment was bombed. And they had numerous books, but they were strewn about. Well, David found, when in the course of our interviews, found that there were about 10 pages of the diary that his father, Morris, must have stuffed into some book in the bookshelf that they didn't know about. So I have actual, and there are pictures in the book. You could see one picture of his diary. But I was able to piece together from this type of information and create a story, which is why it's biographical fiction. It's truly
Okay.
about us, but create what I perceived uh, must have happened to him as an adolescent
Interesting.
during the Holocaust. He had to hide his Jewish identity. He wasn't sure his comrades would they might retaliate. He didn't know whether his family was alive or dead. He's confronted by incredible war trauma. I mean, the Germans and their collaborators have invaded his country. And here's a 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old kid. And again, as I'm developing these stories, I'm like, what must it have been like for this boy to be in this war, in this situation? And one of the things he said in the interviews with the Shoah Foundation, he said, because somebody asked him, do you want some of that you became a fighter with the resistance? He goes, no, I joined with them basically for protection because he was living in the mountains for weeks and weeks alone at age 11 in the winter in Bosnia. Beforehand, it was a matter of survival. How does an adolescent or younger, I suppose he was adolescent, survive all of this?
Right.
So the resilience is incredible. I refer to it as sort of the jagged edges of resilience because throughout his life, and you see in the epilogue, he and David, his son, had there was tension, and I think it was absolutely related to PTSD throughout. But Morris was an incredible guy, and he did a lot in adulthood. He was a humanitarian.
Okay.
But anyway, again, the story is how does a kid go through this? And that's happening. I think Alyssa, you mentioned earlier, this is happening throughout the world now.
Yeah.
That was my next question for you. What makes this story relevant in today's world? And I think there's a lot of things that we could, relate to for especially youth who are reading this. You can see a lot of comparisons to things happening today.
Right. Interesting, by the way, in terms of it being for young adults. And I've talked with the publisher, and I mean, we agree it's for all ages. I don't know if you two do, but I read a lot of young adult books. I think they're amazing. And many parents read their their students' young adult books to know what they're reading. This is a story I think that's really relevant for all ages, but Amazon somehow listed it as one in a series of Holocaust books for young adults, which I'm fine with. And
Yeah.
I had done some outreach with Jewish organizations or any organizations that so care, and um, they're pleased that there's a young adult book that has to do with this topic and this man,
And
boy.
how did that decision to sort of I don't want to use the word target because we've used it in other contexts in this conversation, but to
Right.
focus your book on a young adult audience potentially, not, as you said, not the sole audience, but maybe one of the primary audiences for the book. How did that shape what you wrote and how you wrote it so that it would, sort of resonate for young adults?
Yeah, I would like to think that I originally no, sorry, I won't use the word, that I originally wrote this for young adults. I actually didn't. I don't consider myself the most sophisticated writer, but more of a storyteller.
Okay.
And I've gotten in the 4 books I've written, you know, I've gotten to be a better storyteller. And I think that's what happened through this. And then the publisher, which is interesting, Amsterdam Publishers in the Netherlands, the woman who founded this company 14 or 15 years ago, her grandparents they helped Jews in Amsterdam and to escape Amsterdam. So Lisbeth is her name. She started this company and they only publish Holocaust memoir or some fiction.
Mm.
So Lisbeth, I'd sent the manuscript, various, iterations. And she said, I think this is a young adult book. She goes, your writing is a bit more your sentences are a bit more staccato, whatever that means. I didn't intend that. And she said, but it's about this boy. And, wouldn't it be something if young adult readers,
Yeah.
connect to what this boy went through? So I said, yeah, I can certainly agree. I didn't start out that way, but I'm good with it.
Interesting. Yeah. And do you anticipate talking to young adults about this, taking it to, taking it on the road, so to speak? I know a lot of authors will go to schools and, talk about their books with young adults. I guess I'm curious if having those conversations is something that you've considered.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know, how, where, and when I'll be traveling. Podcasts I had sent, and I'm, in the process of well, I am doing more presentations in the future, but um there are young adult book review podcasts that I'll be a guest on. So that's another way to reach people. There are young adult Facebook groups,
Yeah.
continue to reach out there. So yeah, absolutely that is going to be happening.
Yeah, and I just asked because I'm curious sort of how you imagine, and again, it's hypothetical, but how you imagine a young adult audience would receive the book. And, I mean, it's about a challenging topic. I mean, it's about a
Right.
topic that maybe some young adults would not naturally gravitate towards, but maybe once they do, really be drawn in by the story and really get immersed in it. So I guess I'm just curious, kind of what those conversations would be like if you were to have them.
Yeah. You know, Morris, like any young adult, however, it's not like any adult because of the situation he's thrust into. But in one of the threads throughout the story is he has a crush on one of the older teenage partisans who's a few years older than him.
Okay.
But he's very much, he's 12 and 13, and he's said, no. He reminds him, no, we're just friends. But he wants more. If that's, at his age, it's a very obviously, a
Yeah.
very conflicted time for young people. So I think therein even if now young adult is from 12 on,
Right.
it's 18 or 19, but I think people will relate to that because we've all been adolescents, and we've all had,
Sure.
confusions and conflicts and crushes and, insecurities. And could you imagine though, and this is what I'm hoping that young readers and all readers, imagine all of these developmental issues really, but you're fighting to liberate your country from Nazis. I mean, that's
Yeah.
pretty heavy. So I hope it's a learning experience, and I hope people of any age will connect with what Morris went through.
And the fictional element of what you've written is that you took his story, the pieces that you could gather of his story
Right.
from his diary and from his son, and
Right.
then sort of added your own imaginative, storytelling skills to kind of shape that into a narrative, I'm imagining, right?
Yeah, and then the interviews from Shoah Foundation.
Hmm.
Uh, I found a couple articles that one in particular, Morris's sister wrote about her experience. And there's also there's an incredible documentary called Saved by Language, which was the first thing I actually viewed with Morris being interviewed. There's a professor at Binghamton named Brian Kirchen, and he's professor of linguistics. And there's a language called Ladino, which fits very much into Morris's life. And Ladino was developed by Jews exodusing 400 or more years ago from Spain and Portugal, from the Inquisitions. And they went through, various countries and Turkey and eventually, the Bosnia area, Yugoslavia. And the language, it's called Judeo-Espanol. And it's
Hmm.
very much like Spanish. Has Italian in it, French, Turkish, Arabic, Aramaic. And this is a great documentary. But Morris tells some stories in that documentary. And so I'm able to expand upon that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how I created it. I'm sure it probably took me a year and a half or so to just write the book.
Well, it's a big accomplishment, I think, writing any book. And now this is your fourth, and it's, kind of sounds like it's pushing you into new creative territory and new styles of writing and new forms of writing and research. And, it really sounds intriguing. I can't wait to read it myself.
Thank you.
And
Thank
one thing I really enjoy is how we talked about your progression from being a social work student through your career and how you ended up
Hmm.
here. And I do love how there's certain elements that still connect to that social work. You're still trying, you're building relationships or making connections. You had this diary and you're talking to the individual's son and you're working to build the relationships to then tell a story to reach individuals who might never have heard this story. You're raising awareness. And I do like that the elements of social work are still there in your work
Yeah.
and writing, both through your research for the book and also taking this book and sharing it with an audience to raise awareness about important topics and issues that are relevant today.
thank you. I mean, there's no question that that's at the core of who I am. It truly is. And I tell people, and if I'm going when I go in other interviews or I'm talking, it really started with my social work education, but progressed with my learning to be, a better and better social worker and
Hmm.
finding my niche, particularly I sit in the much more humanistic or humanist role. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, so and that transferred to being a middle school teacher as well. And then to my writing. And again, I said earlier, we don't know what where we're going to be later on. I had no idea I was going to do writing, none whatsoever, but I was pushed by what I saw my students were going through the first time for the first book, that they were so concerned about parents being deported. And I said, I need to do something about this. And it came about, like I said, it was somewhat cathartic for me to tell these stories. I don't think it was I don't know how many people bought the book. I don't usually focus on that at all. But it was from that point I said, I want to be able to bring me and my learning and my own experiences
Mm.
transfer those to the characters, whether, historical fiction, biographical fiction, transfer those to the characters, because that's what I want to express from my core.
It's funny, I think about listening to you talk, I think about your journey as being a non-traditional social work journey, but in some ways it's, right in the norm for social work, that social workers can do all sorts of things, and that they start off with a degree in social work, but often end up in very different places by the, middle and later parts of their career, that there's just different pathways to take. And so even the term non-traditional doesn't quite capture it, but you've kind of followed your own path and figured out how to use your voice. And that's a theme that Alyssa and I talk about a lot on this show, is sort of how do social workers find their voice, whether it's through storytelling, whether it's through academia and research, whether it's through helping individuals with similar lived experiences. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that social workers, and advocating and, getting involved in activism efforts. It's another way social workers might find their voice, engaging with the media, doing podcasts. And, these are the kind of things we talk about and get excited about in terms of what social work can offer folks. So it's really exciting to hear you connect those threads for us.
Thank you. And you mentioned activism. All of my books truly are sort of a quieter form of activism. Excuse me, my wife is a cancer researcher. She went to Albany Med actually for her PhD. And she's working for a Korean-based company. So a couple of years ago, I went to Korea with her, and I was able to give a presentation about the war in Bosnia. There was a gender studies program at Seoul National University, and I had reached out and they said, yeah, we want a presentation in gendercide, which I hadn't even really heard the term, but it's one of the tools, the horrific tools of war that many employ. It's killing, sexual assault, rape, people of both genders, right? And so I gave this presentation, and I'm thinking, one of the professors there asked me, why do you think this happens? How do humans get this way? And I don't quite totally remember the answer, but I remember feeling very much like a social worker, but saying, I write my books so people ask these questions, and we hopefully will learn from them, including the new one, that this is not how we want human beings to be. This is not. We have not evolved yet, and we unfortunately see we have not. We see this continuing to go on in the world, but in a quiet, my own way, I'm hoping my books touch people and they say, wow, could this happen here?
Right. Right.
So that is, so you mentioned activism or advocacy, that is certainly part of why I write.
Yeah. So if you just tuned in, we're talking with Jordan Sher, who has a brand new book. He's an alum from the University of Albany School of Social Welfare, 1981, with a master's degree in social work. And the new book that Jordan has written is called Dark Shadows Hover. Thanks for talking with us, Morris. Alyssa, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I'm just going to say I'm really excited to read this book, and I want to thank you for always coming on and sharing your expertise. And I love that one of the things that I do love is how you talked about how you kind of evolved in your career, starting with social work, moving to teaching, now writing. So many of our students always say they think that they have to figure everything out right when they're still in school, and that's going to be the career that they have for their entire lives. And so much of what we do in the field influences us and impacts our next steps. And where you are now has, evolved from all the experiences that you have had through your years of social work practice and your teaching. So I just am really glad that you came on and also offered that to us, because it shows that, there's so much more we still continue to learn outside of the classroom and post-graduation. So I'm very excited to read your book, and I thank you for helping to continue to raise awareness about these important issues And, like we said, Eric had said, this is the point of our show, is to, have social workers be the media, engage the media, get the message out there. And you're doing that through your books. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. And happy 60th anniversary.
That's great. That's the School of Social Welfare's 60th anniversary year. And, you're an example of just a tremendous career post social work at University at Albany. And it's really great to see our alum out there doing creative things. And I'm really struck by your sort of focus on storytelling. And I know, even in the classroom, we talk about the lost art of storytelling, that, our society is focused on bite-sized chunks of information these days, and the attention to longer form storytelling is really, really important and makes a difference in a way that social media can't, just with the sort of 30-second bite-sized chunks that everybody consumes daily. So it's really great to hear you talk about storytelling too. So thank you for that, Jordan.
You're welcome. I appreciate you recognizing that. I do.
So we look forward to having you on again. You're a regular now. We've had you on twice, and I guess folks can find your book at various places online. It's called Dark Shadows Hover, and the author is Jordan Sher, Sher. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yeah, it's usually just quick story. There's a man in Denver named Jordan Sher, and he writes books, but I think they're more business books. So I years ago, after the first book, changed my author name Jordan Steven, Steven Sher.
Okay.
Confused with the athletic, better-looking, younger guy in Denver. I'm here in Northern California. Anyway. Yeah.
So folks should look, if you're interested in this conversation and you've enjoyed listening to Jordan talk, it's Jordan Steven Sher, and the book is called Dark Shadows Hover, and I hope listeners will consider checking that out. It sounds fascinating, and it was great talking with you. So thanks for being our guest here on the Social Workers, WCDB Albany.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you.